Welcome to Wednesday Inspirational Book Lounge. I'm Anna Murby, your host. This season, we're reading Mephibosheth, A Twisted Life of Unexpected Grace and Mercy, the true story of a medically fragile child whose life became a living testimony of God's grace. This book invites us into a story of deep love and brokenness, revealing how God's mercy often shines brightest in the most fragile lives. Enjoy the episode.
Mephibosheth, A Twisted Life of Unexpected Grace and Mercy by Chaplain Aaron. Read by Hubert Carl. Chapter 1. The Child Paid the Price. It was a twisted pile of skin, bones, and sinew, so misshapen that even knowing that it was a person did little to help the eye accept it as human. This was not the result of a car accident or a sudden catastrophe. It looked instead like a train wreck of humanity itself. The damaged body, skin barely holding its form, resembled a crumpled aluminum can discarded along the roadway. The horror of the sight was almost unbearable, as the reality of the damage stood plainly before the observer. The heart was beating, yet the body appeared devoid of wholeness, more matter than life. The lungs drew in the breath that sustains life, but in such odd and strenuous way that even hearing it felt painful. One could not help to ask what hideous twist of fate would allow any soul to endure such damage in a single lifetime. And yet the most disheartening truth was this: it was not fate. It was not accident. It was not miscalculation. The devastation both for them was the result of a process long familiar to doctors, nurses, and parents alike. On this day, a child was born into the world. This is the true story of a young boy born into a modern world, one filled with remarkable medical advances, sterile hospital corridors, and the quiet confidence that technology can mend nearly anything. And yet, through no fault of his own, this child entered the world already bearing wounds that no machine could undo. His extreme physical and neurological deformities were not the result of chance, but of deliberate and careless choices made while he was being formed in the womb. Before this story can speak of grace, it must speak of truth. For a single chapter, I ask the reader to walk through realities that are difficult to face. What follows is not written to accuse, but to illuminate, to show how certain patterns of vice leave lasting marks on bodies not yet born, and how violence, neglect, and chemical dependency continues to shape lives long after birth. These truths are not confined to the past. They remain present, unfolding quietly and persistently even now. There will be good news, abundant and certain, but understanding requires context. One cannot grasp the weight of mercy without first seeing the depth of the wound it answers. In this world, there are those who are careless, those who act with deliberate cruelty, and far fewer those who choose to rescue what others have already written off. The accounts that follow are drawn from more than 50 years of experience by Paul and Dale Luce, who opened their home to children marked by profound damage and fragile hope. For the sake of dignity and legacy, each child would be given a biblical name, reflecting the belief of this loving couple, that even the shortest life can bear a name that outlives it. The boys in the system. This is not the first or the last of boys or girls that pass through social services. The family that will care for so many will focus their care on specific care and request for a home full of boys. It was a personal decision based on wisdom, understanding, and choice of direction. Many emergency opportunities were offered, and even though this family would help all who entered their house, here are a couple of examples of boys that made their dreadful way into this world. There was Jacob. Jacob arrived carrying what the system often labels as expected complications. His mother's repeated use of readily available drugs during pregnancy left its mark early and permanently. His spine did not close as it should have. Portions of bone and tissue protruded through the skin along his back and neck, leaving the spinal cord exposed, unprotected in ways the human body was never meant to endure. Infection was a constant threat. Injury was almost inevitable. His limbs twisted inward as he grew, muscles pulling against one another without coordination. Speech never formed. What emerged instead were sounds, howls, gasps, snorts, raw expression of a mind trapped inside a body that would not obey. Jacob's life was marked not by milestones, but by vigilance. Every movement risked damage. Every day required protection. There was Samuel. Samuel screamed through his nights and days, not because of physical pain, but because his body had learned fear before it learned safety. His father lived in a fog of alcohol and drugs, and one day that fog turned violent. In a fit of rage, he grabbed the toddler and struck furniture with his small body, as though the child were an object rather than a son. The fractures were extensive: arms, ribs, legs, skull. Doctors were astonished he survived, but broken bones heal. What did not heal was the damage done when the child was shaken and thrown. His brain suffered trauma from violent acceleration and deceleration, what medicine recognized as shaken baby syndrome. Neural connections were torn, spinal signals disrupted. Though his body recovered enough to walk, his mind remained locked in terror. For the first year, Samuel had to be kept apart from the others. Sudden sounds sent him spinning. Touch caused him panic. His body had healed, but his nervous system lived as though the danger was still present. Gideon came next. Gideon was born with several drugs already moving through his bloodstream. He was striking, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, alert. At first glance, he looked like the kind of child people expected to grow strong and carefree, but his body told a different story. He could not swallow. His muscles did not coordinate properly, and attempts to feed him normally resulted in choking and aspiration. A feeding tube was placed directly into his abdomen to keep him alive. Breathing proved no easier. His airway was collapsed repeatedly, unable to remain open under the strain of normal respiration. Eventually, surgeons placed a tracheotomy. Gideon lived surrounded by tubes, machines, and alarms. He was bright and responsive, trapped inside a body dependent on plastic and pressure to survive. He often looked less than a child and more like a medical device in motion. It was not fair, and everyone knew it. Joseph's story began differently. Joseph was born healthy, strong. His body showed no immediate signs of damage. But the danger came later, delivered not through chemicals, but through rage. One winter day, his father, consumed by methamphetamine fury, took the crying infant and plunged him into boiling water. Then, in a moment of continued violence, threw the child into the snow outside. The burns were severe, skin sloughed away, nerve endings were destroyed. Ironically, the freezing snow slowed the further damage, preserving what little tissue remained. A stranger heard the screaming and intervened. Joseph lived, but his body would forever bear the scars of that day: skin grafts, constrictures, and chronic pain. Then there was Daniel. Daniel tested positive for fetal alcohol exposure. He was not visibly deformed, but the damage ran deep and wide. Alcohol had disrupted brain development in ways that would never fully reverse, affecting impulse control, learning, memory, and emotional regulation. His mother lived on the streets, drifting in and out of temporary stability. Authorities returned Daniel to her repeatedly, hoping each time that circumstances had improved. They had not. One day she collapsed unconscious in a gutter. Daniel, still strapped into his stroller, rolled unattended down the street, inches from traffic, unseen by passers-by. That was the day the foster services finally intervened. It was not a dramatic act of violence that saved him, but a quiet accumulation of neglect. These boys were not exceptions. They were patterns. Some arrived twisted before birth by chemicals they never chose. Others were broken afterwards by violence, neglect, or terror inflicted by those meant to protect them. Some bore physical deformities. Others carried invisible wounds, neurological injuries, disrupted spinal signals, minds locked in fear or confusion. In every case, the conclusion was the same. The child paid the price. These were only a few of the boys who passed regularly through the hands of social services. Some had nearly drowned and would live the rest of their lives with profound cognitive impairment. Others bore injuries inflicted in moments of drug-fueled rage. Still others entered the world already twisted by substance consumed long before their first breath. In every variation, the conclusion was the same. The child paid the price. What deepened the tragedy was not only the damage itself, but the response to it. More than once, doctors asked plainly why such children should be kept alive at all. Social workers, following policies and pressures above them, often encouraged abortion at the first indication of deformity in the womb. Compassion was redefined. Efficiency replaced mercy. Innocent lives were weighed against inconvenience. Once again, without exception, the child paid the price. Mephibosheth entered the world under circumstances no child should endure. His first breath came with forceful scream, sharp and insistent, but it did not sound like ordinary crying. The sound was strained and high-pitched, as though his little body were forcing air through the passage not meant to carry it. Each breath followed the last with effort, distorted and unsettling to hear. The umbilical cord had already been cut when the nurse offered the mother the opportunity to hold her child. She pushed the nurse's arm away. The very suggestion repelled her. She had shown no interest before the pregnancy, none during it, and none now. She cursed aloud, voicing her own demands and asking for relief. Another fix, another escape. The child was cleansed, carefully wrapped, and placed into an incubator due to his premature and fragile condition. Once the immediate urgency passed, the nurse stepped back and really looked at what had just been born. She took in the evidence of prolonged exposure to substances that move through the child's developing body and nervous system long before birth. Even then, an infant feels pain, and this child had known it early. The deformities were now unmistakable. A swollen head, twisted limbs, a cleft palate, a body shaped by suffering before it ever drew a breath of its own. The nurse felt a shiver pass through her, not from cold, but from the weight of what this child had already endured and what he would almost certainly face in the short life predicted for him. Questions rose unbidden. Was there anything to look forward to? Was there an explanation sufficient to justify such suffering? Behind her, the machine hummed. In front of her, a life struggled quietly within plastic walls. Within hours, the mother was taken into law enforcement custody on charges of child endangerment. What little claim she had left was severed, and the future of the medically fragile infant was handed over to the system. Paperwork would follow. Decisions would be made. The language of custody and prognosis would replace the language of family. In that small moment, between an arrest and an incubator, the life of one small boy hung in the balance. What remained unanswered was not whether he would live long. What remained unanswered was who would claim him and what name would be spoken over him.
Thank you for joining us today. Make sure to come back next week for another installment of Mephibosheth, A Twisted Life of Unexpected Grace and Mercy.